Hello, and welcome to today's maintenance video. Today, I'm going to talk about installing your auxiliary filter. The auxiliary filter is an option you can add to your machine's coolant system to filter out fine particles that would otherwise clog the coolant lines in your machine. This is especially useful when cutting abrasive materials that leave behind small chips like cast iron. Customers occasionally call us with coolant issues from an incorrectly installed auxiliary filter. So let's take a look at the right way to install your auxiliary filter so you can avoid these issues. Before we begin, it is important to note that the auxiliary filter is routed differently when being installed on a machine with a standard coolant pump versus a machine with HPC, high pressure coolant, or TSC, Through-Spindle coolant. So make sure you're doing the correct procedure which corresponds with the coolant configuration on your machine. Begin by lifting the auxiliary filter and hooking it onto the handle of the coolant tank. When installing an auxiliary filter on a machine with a standard coolant pump, route it so that the auxiliary filter output connects directly into the machine. The auxiliary filter output, or supply hose, is the hose located at the base of the unit. Disconnect the machine-side coolant supply hose from the outlet of the coolant pump and connect it to the supply hose coming from the auxiliary filter. Connect the upper auxiliary filter hose to the coolant pump outlet. Make sure all the connections are tight to avoid leaks. Now, close all the doors and windows on the machine and turn on the coolant pump. Coolant should now flood in and fill the tank. Make sure to let the coolant pump run for a few minutes to allow all the air in the lines to escape. When installing an auxiliary filter on a machine with through-spindle or high-pressure coolant, ensure that the filter is connected to the TSC or HPC pump and not the standard coolant pump. Begin by removing the coolant return loop. Connect the upper hose to the stand pipe. Connect the lower auxiliary filter hose to the swivel fitting on the outlet pipe. Make sure that all your fittings are tight to ensure that no coolant leaks. Close all the doors and windows on the machine and turn on the standard coolant pump. You can do this in MDI by pressing the coolant button or commanding an M8. While the coolant is on, open up the lid of the auxiliary filter. Using the wash gun, fill the auxiliary filter tank with coolant to remove any air in the system. When the auxiliary filter tank is full, close the lid, making sure to match the alignment marks, and clamping each set of opposite clamps to ensure the lid seats evenly. One important thing to note is that if your machine was built before 2014, the hose routing between the auxiliary filter and the TSC and HPC pump is flipped from what I've shown. These pumps do not have the auto clean feature, which means they will not have the cylinder that you see here. For these pumps, the upper hose is connected to the adapter on the right and the lower hose is connected to the standpipe on the left. Now your coolant system is all set up and you are good to run parts. If your auxiliary filter is installed correctly, but you are still running into issues with your coolant flow, there are a couple things that you can check. The filter tank should always be full, but if the tank drains itself in between uses, check the lid for coolant leaks and make sure the hoses are properly connected between the pump, filter, and the machine. If your tank has a pressure gauge, check the gauge to determine if you need to replace the filter. If the gauge reads between 0 and -5 psi, the pump is operating normally. If the gauge reads -5 to -10 psi, this indicates the pump is working harder than it should and the bag may need to be replaced. If your tank doesn't have a pressure gauge, clean or replace the bag monthly. Note that every time you remove the lid to replace the filter, you will need to go through the process of refilling the tank and removing the air in the system. For standard pumps, this is as simple as running the coolant pump for a few minutes. For TSC and HPC pumps, you must use the wash gun to fill up the tank before closing the lid and running the TSC or HPC pump. For more service tips, visit haascnc.com/service and we'll see you next time.